Hey guys, and welcome to Follow My Edit, the show where you and I work on the same image together step by step. In today's episode, we're going to edit this into this. And if you're anything like me, I learn much better by doing than just watching. So in the description down below here, there's a link to download the same raw file that I'll be working on so you can literally follow my edit. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy the process. Let's get started. As you can see right here, I'm using Lightroom Classic. However, if you are using any other Adobe photo editing software, the steps will be literally one by one the same. From Photoshop to Lightroom, Camera Raw, all of them have the same tools available, the same sliders and buttons. If you haven't done any Lightroom so far, why didn't you go and check out my Lightroom course for beginners at the Pangolin Photo Academy and start off with that? If you, on the other hand, don't like Adobe at all and you're using a completely different photo editing software, don't worry about it because the tools I will be showing you should be available one-on-one in your software, from cropping to dodge and burn and sharpening. All these things you should be able to follow along regardless. So let's dive right in. For this show, I have chosen the quintessential Chobe shot. You have two elephants playing, swimming in the water. Very, very often the sun rises and sets pretty quickly here in Africa. So we get a very, very short golden hour, which means in our summertime, the light can be harsh by 8 a.m. And that's what we can see here. We get very, very harsh shadows on this photograph. When it's hot, that's when our elephants love swimming, so we got to deal with this somehow. We have a bit of a crooked horizon here, and as you can see, not a lot of cropping space as they are playing together. I've been shooting this on a 24 megapixel camera, and I always look at my settings first. So I shot it on 2.5 thousandths of a second so that I could freeze any water splashing that would occur from the elephant swimming on a pretty wide aperture because they were all in one plane, and with a broad daylight that didn't give me a very high ISO, so I'm not expecting a ton of noise. The whole thing was overexposed by a full light stop because we have almost black looking skin in very, very bright water. What I do like is that the riverbank is not quite cutting off their head on top. We have a unique colored background that is sometimes quite difficult to achieve in Chobe. And when I magnify by 100%, we're going to have a quick look to see, yes, it is entirely sharp. The eyelashes are sharp. And it seems like both of our elephants are sharp. So that looks great. Let's have a quick deep dive into our histogram. We have a very high contrast picture from very, very dark blacks to almost white tones. So you can see this little peak here in our blacks. That is part of our elephants. So is this. So this is the data we're going to be editing for our subject. And I must admit, data in the shadows and the blacks is often towards the end of the dynamic range, is sometimes a bit difficult to edit, not as high quality data. We have very little sitting in the midtones, and then obviously all these bright tones. If I would have wanted to shift this data further into my midtones, I would have probably shifted my brights off the histogram. I would have clipped my white point, I would have burned something. As I tick this, have a look. If anything turns out red, I have a tiny little red mark on the tusk. So I might have burned this. This is the best of both worlds of capturing the elephants without clipping our black point and the background without clipping our white point. A very high contrast image. After looking at that, I now know that the data I'm most interested in sits in my blacks and in my shadows, I might find some noise after all. So let's have a look at that. Plus that crooked sort of horizon. You see the water is also trailing off a little bit to the bottom right here. So I always tend to start with a crop. There we go. And in order to straighten these two out, I'm probably not going to use this because the river is taking a turn here. I'm going to use the ripples in the water, and you have two options. Either you can hover so you see the curvature of the arrow and then just do it according to your eye, something like that. Or you take this little angle and you follow a ripple in the water as needed. So how much would I want to crop this? Oh, no, this looks actually quite crooked. Let me change my mind. I'm going to use the top horizon here back into my cropping tool. See, sometimes if you have multiple lines available, it's not that easy. Yeah, that looks all right. How much more do I want to crop? If I had a choice, I would probably crop the white and the green out. I prefer less color changes in the background, and this is sort of a few hot spots that are distracting. But for now, I'm choosing not to clip the butt of the younger elephant or the ears, so I'm going to leave it at this. We can always have a look later if we prefer a closer crop. In addition, then I'm going into my basic. First things first, a lot of my guests start to go into local area masks and start editing, let's say, the little burnt tusks or individual bits. But let's get the overall data right first. I like my overall exposure. I've discussed that through my histogram, so I'm going to start with my whites and my blacks as I normally do. I'm going to pull my whites until I just don't clip my white point. I clip my white point wherever I see white, and I'm going to edit for my subject. So now we already determined the tusk burns pretty quickly, so I'm not going to give the tusk too much attention. I can edit that later on with a local area mask. I'm going to see where the white starts popping up in my elephant, and I see it on the left hand side in the ear. There's a few little sparkles, so I'm going to pull it somewhere here just to make sure that the majority of the skin gets enough brightness. And then we're going to take our blacks, and as expected, we see our blacks pretty quickly because we have that shady skin there on the side. I'm going to actually pull it again, not until that cheek is visible, because I expect that to be visible very quickly, but until I see some blacks on the trunk or on the ear, because that is the majority of the skin. That made this even darker, but now we can go specifically into the shadows in a regular exposure where I have both light on my subject and light in my background. I tend to pull my shadows to the plus side. If you would want an high dynamic range HDR type of shot, you might pull it all the way. I find that is unnecessary, but I'm going to pull it quite a bit. About 50 points. This is not an exact science, ladies and gentlemen, because a few points here or there don't make a big difference. It's just the general way forward that I would choose for this picture. If you enjoy what you're doing there with me, please don't forget to click the like button just down below, or even subscribe to our channel, because that will help us produce more of these videos in the future. And then I will pull the highlights all the way actually down to the left side, and you feel that almost washed out look that I had created by making it so bright is now looking great. I get some details back in my background as well as the sunny part of my elephants. By pulling the blacks to the minus side and pulling the whites to the plus side, I have now created a much higher contrast in my picture. If you want to have a look how it looked before, there we go, and afterwards. Before and afterwards. The beauty is you can always go back in your history. Beautiful. From my basic setup, I'm gonna now go into my details. When we're in the details, we need to sharpen this shot. As it is a raw file, it is already sharpened by 40 points because by definition it's sort of flat and soft. And the way I do it, instead of sharpening every single pixel in this frame, because it really isn't all too relevant to sharpen this spot right here, nor is it relevant to sharpen this spot, I tend to mask my sharpening process, and that means we only sharpen very distinct pixels. Why is that? Because I'm going to over magnify here for the moment just so you can see. That is because sharpening in general produces this little flaky look, and it does it specifically in the darker area. So you see, if I pull my sharpening tool, it almost looks crunchy, for lack of better term. So then I don't create crunchiness all throughout the image, such as my background, I mask it. This is particularly important when you have high noise images, high ISO images, because the sharpening process makes that grainy look even more crunchy. So in order to mask it, I'm gonna take the masking slider, I'm gonna grab it, and I'm gonna push my Option key on Mac or my Alt key on a Windows computer, and this is what's gonna happen. The amount of sharpening that we define up here is only being put into the white pixels. So everything that's black is not being sharpened, is not being touched. Before we masked, that was everything. Everything was sharpened equally. And we only want the very outlines of our animal. I usually mask anywhere between 80 and 100 points, somewhere here. And this is now the only time I happen to over magnify, because only when you over magnify can you truly see whether you over sharpened. So I'm gonna go somewhere relevant. This is somewhere where I have a lot of texture. And it was at 40 points, somewhere around here. And I'm going to pull it all the way to the right to see the type of damage that's being done. And then I'm going to pull it back until the crunchiness that I now see in some of the outlines is less. And we can actually sharpen this image quite significantly. I'm quite happy. But you might notice, together with me, that we have some weird colorations in this chunk. Do you see those pink and green pixels here? This is what we call color noise. We have two types of noise. We have luminance noise, which is a type of grain, and then we have color noise, which is these pink and green spots that we particularly find in dark surface areas. And you see Lightroom already tries to reduce it by 25%, and regardless, we are still sitting here with the same problem. So I can try and reduce it more, and as I'm reducing it, I see there is much less of these odd spots showing through my image. There's a lot of pink and purple now, and there's much less of it. So reducing color noise has a much less harming effect than reducing luminance noise, which usually tends to make our picture look quite smooth and almost like plastic, because there's not a ton of luminance noise. This is a bad example, but color noise reduction doesn't harm your image much. It sometimes makes it a bit flatter, but if I have a good look here, this looks beautiful to me. And as I'm expecting much more color noise coming out of this shady area later, I'm simply going to get rid of it as much as I can. So now, ladies and gentlemen, sharpening and denoising and details like that really don't matter much if you plan on showing your image very small only. Let's say on a phone, on Instagram, sending some messages to each other on the phone. However, if you would like to print or you want to show it on a nice big TV screen, these steps are crucial that the image looks proper afterwards. After sharpening the image wonderfully, I tend to have a look at my colors. And I do that in my color mixer. And now you might say that We do not want to change the colors that we've seen, that we don't want to make it unnatural, but please remember that the colors thrown together by Adobe here are not the colors we naturally saw out there in the field. Adobe doesn't always know how to interpret the raw data, and they give you one out of many different possibilities. Thereby, I want to have a double check as to the colors and if they look natural to my eye. That's something that you develop over time, an awareness of color. And the more you start focusing on it and looking for it, the more it jumps out at you. In this case, because our light was very even both in the background and pretty much on the majority of our subject, I don't see funny colors here. We often see purples and blues in wet animals in Botswana because the sky reflects off the wet skin, and I see a few blues on these animals, but nothing that seems awfully unnatural as the sky would naturally reflect. If you have a look and I take the saturation out of the blues, obviously the sky and the water becomes less, but please focus on the elephant and see how much blue color I can take out of that elephant, making it more gray. That being said, it is perfectly natural that every pixel has a certain percentage of blue, so I don't really want to take the blue color out here entirely. If you find it a bit much in the water, you can take the saturation down a little bit in the water. I often find that skies and waters tend to look a little bit oversaturated. Wonderful. Now that I feel that the overall image is well edited, we can now move on to our local area masking, in which we can choose to edit a certain part of the image individually. But because our eyes have a pretty good dynamic range, we can see a lot more detail in the shadow. So I want to try and get more information in the shadow and make it all look a bit more even and not as patchy as what it currently does. My very first mask on this image will be a subject detect, and Adobe did fabulous, and it found both of my elephants in order to try and make my subject stand out a little bit more. The way I tend to do that is by approaching texture and clarity. It's very subjective if you want to use it. In humans, please don't use it. You will make humans look much older, much more scrawny. But in animals, especially monochrome animals, zebras, sort of grayish elephants with a lot of texture, it can look fantastic. It looks awful in lions. So be very wary where you use it and how much you use of it. In this case, I want to show you on 100% magnification. Please always use the navigator once you're in the local area masks, because that is the only way you can move around without shifting the mask. You will see that clarity will make things even blacker and even brighter. It's a combination mask out of contrast, whites and blacks and sharpness. And texture will give us a little bit more brightness, almost lifting the shadows a bit. Both of it will make our texture stand out a bit more. I prefer texture over clarity in many cases. I find it less destructive, but you can use a little bit of both. And then I tend to move back into my shadows. And what that does, it will provide a bit of light on our animal as if they're standing on a stage and getting the spotlight essentially. You could also see it a bit as a fill-in flash. Again, we don't want it too obvious. A little bit goes a long way because you will see how much more our animal already stands out. Next, I will have a look at my background. This image was shot at 3.2 of an aperture, so I have a beautifully far set background that blurred stunningly on 3.2, and I can't find any grain, so I really think I shouldn't be touching up on my background at all. Now we get to the crucial part of the image, the part that bugged me the most, and that is the inconsistency in light. You find very bright highlights all throughout the wet skin. Obviously the tusk is standing out. His face is so much brighter than the face of the elephant that we can actually see better. And then we have some glowing spots in the backdrop here that could also be a little bit distracting if we don't choose to crop it away. So let's have a look. I'm going to start with the highlights, and the way I'm going to do it is I'm going to create separate brushes for different highlighted parts. My first brush will address all the super bright spots on our elephant. I'm going to have a relatively high feather or full feather, full flow, full density. That way I don't create harsh corners in my edit, and I'm going to sort of draw over all the areas that I find much brighter than the rest. A little bit here on the ear, the long hair, and it is quite important that you keep the auto mask ticked. That way you're not gonna automatically draw into super dark parts. Where else? I find that the corner of this elephant's trunk, and then obviously a lot of this little one's face is very, very sparkly. The tusk I will touch separately because I don't want to underdo it or overdo it in certain sections. So I'm going to try and keep sections together here on the butt that are similar in highlights. A little bit bright here, a little bit bright here, maybe here. There we go. So now I'm going to end up taking the highlights because that's what the problem is, and I assume my data actually sits in the highlights for these spots. I'm going to take the highlights down, and you see how it starts looking much more like the rest of the elephant without being completely dark. It may be brighter, but not that dark. And I want to increase my temperature a bit just to make these bits a little bit more earthy as well and less snow white and glaring. So the difference is before and after, and you can tell we have a much more even look to our elephants. We can actually also take the exposure down a little bit if we want to sort of add the overall luminance and bring that down in this section. There we go. I'm going to create different masks now for different areas. We're going to create a next mask, and that mask is going to be for our tusk. And I believe our tusk, we checked at the beginning, is slightly burned. So when we bring that down, you'll see there is gray tones. Wherever you see gray tones, you can be certain that there is no data left. I'm going to erase a little bit. In the back, you see that back part doesn't need to be darkened as much as the front part. So I'm going to take the flow down a bit. So I want a little bit of edit on this part, but not as strongly. So we want to soften the red on this side. There we go. Now we're going to bring it back to a point where we don't see the gray too obvious. But what we're going to do afterwards is add a ton of temperature. And what that does is it's going to turn that sort of grayish white into more of an ivory white, no pun intended, an off-white. Now I'm going to shift this little window here because I want to start working in these little spots up here. They're not true hot spots as the tusk was. However, they are quite bright and quite distracting because they have nothing to do with this image. And I want this to look more like an even forest than a town. So I'm gonna move in to these spots, make my mask quite big so I can just sort of dabble on these spots. And my idea is to make them darker, fit in more with these bluish green tones, make them warmer a little bit so it fits more with the grass, but also bring the tint down towards the green side. So now the background. Ugh, maybe a little bit too saturated. Bring the saturation down a bit. And you notice that I have these rings that I'm not a big fan of. So we're going to have to erase a bit with a lower flow in the outer circle, just so that the changes that we have done are implemented without any obvious corners. There we go. Blend it in a bit. Still, they're brighter. Of course, we can take the highlights down a bit more. I'm still on the eraser. Blend, 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 blend. There we go. But if I turn the mask off, you see how much more disturbing this was. Now that we've addressed all the highlights, I want to now hit that super dark spot that I've been pointing out that really bothers me. Let's have a look. We're going to create a new mask. Once again, a brush. We want to make sure our feather flow and density are up. And we're going to go into the shadows separately, just like we did with the highlights. We're going to mask everything that is almost super black on our friend here. Make my mask a tiny bit smaller. It's really important the auto mask is on so you don't draw into the bright parts by accident. Okay. I think we've got most of it. In this time, opposite, we're going to pull the shadows to the plus side, like we pulled the highlights to the minus side. And you see how much detail there is. I'm going to zoom in or magnify in so you see how much more noise is in these details as well. If I brighten this a lot, you'll find quite a bit of noise there. But it really does not match the color or the luminance, now it looks white, of our sunny bit. So we're gonna obviously move back on these. We want a significant amount of detail. And then you'll say, hey, Janine, this looks flat. This looks almost white. No, it doesn't look white. What it does is it looks cold. All shadows have super blue tints to them. So the trick here is also to raise the temperature. And as we raise the temperature, do you see how the skin of the shadow is adapting to the sunny, brighter bits? Really beautifully. My idea is not to make this bit as bright as the top. Shadows are natural, that's fine. But I want to look into the shadows. Before and after. Now we do this with all the separate shady parts. We have the little mouth of the elephant, the younger elephant. And that little mouth looks very cut off. So I'm going to brighten this quite strongly and warm it up. Look at that so that it looks less cut off and more like it was wet. And then we obviously have the back side. I'm going to increase the size of my brush a bit. Here we even have the trunk curled up of the older elephant that I would like to see. We have the top part of this trunk, and we're going to pull the shadows out, pull the exposure out a little bit, and warm it up. Look at that. Yes, we have a shadow. Shadows are natural, but it isn't quite as strong as what we had before. Before and after. What we have now created is a much more even looking photograph. We have taken care of most of the patches, most of the hotspots that draw our eye away. I find this is quite a nice reflection of the tusk, and I don't think it is too bright. What I still think is that this face is slightly too bright. So I'm gonna just bring a brush, bring my exposure down a bit, and just darken this face a little bit more. There we go. Without darkening the entirety of the photograph, because I think the water is dark and blue enough. There we go. And I think we've created a beautiful photograph that is almost shot like it was taken during the last bit of our golden hour rather than the harsh sunlight that creates the worst shadows. As always, post-production is highly subjective, and as you saw in my thought process, not always linear. I would love to hear from you in the comment section down below if you liked what I did or what you might have done differently. Looking forward to seeing you on a pangolin photo safari very soon. Bye!